In the chaos of urban warfare, nothing disappears faster than a single man. In November 2004, during the Second Battle of Fallujah, a U.S. Marine vanished without a trace. One moment he was clearing a narrow alley with his fire team. The next, he was gone, buried in debris after an explosion, his radio silent, his beacon dead. Command listed him as missing in action, presumed dead. His name was added to the casualty watch list. His family was notified that he had likely perished in combat. But 3 days later, against all odds, he walked out of that city alive. What happened in those 72 hours was never included in the official reports. No photographs, no helmet cam footage. His movements were untracked, his decisions unmonitored. He left behind no witnesses, only shell casings and the bodies of enemy fighters who never expected him to be there. The truth was quietly buried under classified summaries and redacted operations logs. No one wanted to admit a Marine had been left behind in one of the most violent urban zones in modern warfare. And no one wanted to explain how he managed to survive, alone, injured, and hunted, while the city around him burned. What kept him alive was not luck. It wasn't technology or firepower. It was instinct, training, and something deeper. A refusal to die where no one would ever find him. This is the story that was never told. The one that never made headlines. This is what really happened when one man went missing in Fallujah and came back with nothing but scars and silence. The assault on Fallujah was not a sudden decision. It was the culmination of months of intelligence, failed negotiations, and mounting casualties. By early November 2004, Fallujah had become the epicenter of insurgent activity in Iraq, an urban stronghold fortified with foreign fighters, former regime loyalists, and local militias. The city had been transformed into a trap. Every window was a firing port, every alley a kill zone, and every home a potential weapons cache. Operation Phantom Fury was authorized as a full-scale urban invasion, with the goal of retaking the city block by block, room by room. The U.S. military had not undertaken a mission of this complexity since Vietnam. The risk of close-quarter combat was accepted. Civilian evacuation warnings had been issued. What remained inside were enemy combatants prepared to fight to the death and the Marines sent to break through them. He had arrived with the 1st Marine Division 2 days before the push began. His fire team was assigned to Alpha Company, one of the units tasked with breaching the southern industrial sector, a dense cluster of machine shops, concrete bunkers, storage depots, and narrow urban corridors. This was not open warfare. This was knife-range fighting. Engagements would occur at 10 meters or less. The rules of movement were strict. No man entered a room alone. No corridor was crossed without overwatch. They drilled relentlessly in mount training prior to deployment, practicing breaches and clearances in mock buildings under live fire conditions. But Fallujah was different. It was too real. The streets reeked of oil and gunpowder. Smoke lingered from days of preliminary airstrikes. Sandbags were stacked in windows. Makeshift firing positions had been carved into rooftops. The enemy was dug in, disciplined, and fanatical. On the morning of November 9th, Alpha Company moved into Phase 3 of the operation. The southern edge of the city had to be cleared to prevent flanking attacks against the main assault force moving northward. His fire team's mission was to sweep a grid of 5 blocks identified as likely transit points for insurgent couriers and mortar teams. The buildings were tight, with no uniform layout. Many had been rebuilt multiple times, some with hidden crawl spaces and cellars. They moved in formation, point man leading, 2nd and 3rd operators covering flanks, 4th man on rear security. Movement was fluid but cautious. Each block had to be entered, cleared, and secured before they could advance. Resistance was sporadic but vicious. Sniper fire echoed through alleys, and every second room carried the risk of booby traps. They encountered low-grade opposition the first hour. Sporadic AK fire from behind broken windows. A lone RPG fired from a rooftop, minor casualties. The team held formation and pushed forward, supported by distant machine gun overwatch and the occasional burst from an Apache strafing the northern corridor. At approximately 1400 hours, the team entered a split alley separating a collapsed garage from a textile warehouse. Intelligence had flagged the warehouse as a former insurgent checkpoint. The plan was to breach and sweep it, then regroup on the far side where a Humvee unit would rendezvous for resupply. The Marine was positioned in the 2nd slot, covering left flank as the team advanced. The alley narrowed into a choke point where visibility dropped sharply due to stacked debris and the scorched remains of a civilian vehicle. The team slowed, scanning for movement. Then, without warning, automatic fire erupted from a second-story window in the warehouse. Rounds cracked inches above their heads. The point man went down. Simultaneously, a deafening explosion erupted beneath the burned-out car. An improvised explosive device buried under the frame detonated with a blast wave that tore through the corridor like a hammer. The force launched the Marine backward into the adjacent structure. Cinderblock walls collapsed inward. Rebar snapped and concrete dust filled the air. His body slammed against the far wall and was immediately buried under a cascade of rubble. He blacked out for seconds, maybe minutes. When he came to, there was no sound. The gunfire had stopped. The radios were dead. He was alone. He struggled to breathe, spitting out chalky dust and blood. His ears rang with a constant high-pitched whine that dulled all other senses. He tried to speak but couldn't hear his own voice. His helmet had been cracked from the impact, and one of the side straps had snapped. His rifle was gone. He reached for his sidearm and gripped it instinctively, drawing it close to his chest. Every movement caused pain to surge through his ribs and arm. His vision blurred as he tried to orient himself, but all he could see was the ceiling beam above and daylight leaking in through a shattered vent. He pulled himself from the rubble with slow, shuddering movements, crawling past broken furniture, fractured concrete, and blood-streaked dust. He didn't know where the rest of the team was, whether they had advanced or been hit. The comms unit in his vest blinked red. No signal. His GPS was cracked. He had no way to reach anyone. He dragged himself to the far side of the room and pushed open what remained of a doorframe. Outside, the alley was empty. Smoke drifted through the street, but there were no bodies, no sound of friendly forces, no sign of movement. It was as if the city had swallowed everything whole. He was alone in Fallujah, wounded, disoriented, and deep inside one of the most hostile urban environments on Earth. And he would remain that way for the next 72 hours. The silence didn't last. Minutes after dragging himself out of the rubble, the sound of distant gunfire resumed. Sporadic bursts bouncing through concrete walls and echoing down empty alleys like the footsteps of ghosts. The Marine pressed his back against a cracked wall, body low, weapon drawn, lungs still laboring from the dust he had inhaled. His hearing was compromised, a high-frequency ringing distorting every sound and making even his own breathing feel distant. His heart pounded hard enough to feel it in his temples, a slow but steady rhythm reminding him he was alive. The realization of isolation set in not with panic, but with a kind of cold, tactical dread. His fire team was gone. Whether dead, scattered, or exfiltrated, he had no way to find them. His comms device gave nothing but static. The small screen that once fed him coordinates and squad locations was cracked through the middle and flickering. In Fallujah, that was more than a minor setback. It was a death sentence. He checked his magazine, 14 rounds left in the sidearm. His M16 was gone, likely buried somewhere under the collapsed wall, but there was no way to retrieve it. He still had his bayonet, a single field dressing, and a half-full canteen tucked into his belt rig. His arm was bleeding, not fast, but steady. The gash along his forearm had begun to swell, and the exposed muscle beneath the torn skin throbbed with each pulse of his heart. He tore fabric from a fallen curtain inside the building and wrapped it tightly, biting down as the pressure sent white heat up into his shoulder. He didn't have time to fully treat the wound. He needed to move. Fallujah was not a place that tolerated hesitation. He exited the ruined building cautiously, ducking beneath a broken doorway and scanning the alley. The blast had transformed the once navigable space into a corridor of debris and shadows. Bodies were absent, but the blood trail near the blast site told part of the story. Someone had been dragged away. A Marine boot lay near the corner, half burned. He had no idea if it belonged to someone still alive. What he did know was that staying in one place would get him killed. The enemy didn't just fight in Fallujah, they hunted. Snipers moved between buildings with ruthless efficiency. Improvised explosive traps were wired into everyday objects. Triggers hid beneath blankets, doormats, trash. Civilians who had remained were often hostile or coerced into reporting Marine positions. Any sound, any silhouette in a window, could result in sudden death. The Marine chose to vanish. He moved east, away from the initial contact point, deeper into the maze of side streets and courtyards. The city here was a blend of abandoned homes, gutted shops, and partially collapsed mosques. Every step required complete awareness. He walked in shadows, avoided open intersections, and never crossed the same space twice. His pace was slow, methodical. He knew the way insurgents tracked movement, by scent, by blood, by sound. He couldn't afford to leave a trail. He began masking his boot prints by walking along gutters and crushed rebar, using debris to camouflage his route. When he entered buildings, he did so through windows or rooftop breaches, avoiding predictable entryways. He was no longer part of a team. He was prey in an environment designed to trap and kill. Midway through the afternoon, while sheltering inside a shattered dry goods store, he heard footsteps for the first time. Not Marines. Boots too light, the rhythm wrong. Two voices spoke in Arabic just outside the window, followed by the metallic clink of rifle slings. He held his breath, sidearm raised, eyes focused on the dusted sliver of light between the boarded-up front doors. They didn't enter, but he waited nearly 15 minutes before moving again. His nerves were stretched thin, awareness heightened to a painful degree. Every creak in the walls sounded like a footfall. Every gust of wind tapping a loose shutter made his finger twitch. But he held his composure. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to endure. That night, he took shelter in the basement of a bombed-out apartment block. The floor above had collapsed partially, leaving a cavern of broken concrete and wiring. He crawled beneath the rubble into a pocket of space the size of a coffin, and closed his eyes for the first time in nearly 20 hours. Sleep didn't come easily. Every muscle screamed. The wound in his arm had begun to ache with a deep internal heat. He recognized the signs of inflammation, possibly infection. His water was half gone. His weapon, while intact, would be useless in close quarters against multiple enemies. He had no backup, no radio support, no promise that anyone was even looking for him. But the mission hadn't changed. Survive. Avoid capture. Return. That meant rationing energy. That meant observing. That meant learning how Fallujah breathed at night. From his position, he listened to the city come alive in the darkness. Footsteps shuffled outside. Voices passed by in short, clipped bursts. Once he heard a child cry. Another time, a scream cut short in a nearby alley. Dogs barked, then went silent. The city never truly slept, only changed rhythm. By midnight, the moon cast enough light for movement. He crawled out of the basement and began mapping the area in his head. He remembered the layout of Fallujah from briefing maps, but those were outdated. What he found on the ground was different. New barricades, collapsed roadways, entire structures missing. He noted an open cistern near a mosque, possibly usable for water. He spotted 2 enemy firing positions based on trash scatter and cigarette butts. He marked each detail mentally, building a survival map in real time. Just before dawn, while crossing a second-story hallway in a half-demolished clinic, he triggered a tripwire. It was old, maybe a week, maybe more, rigged poorly but still active. A string tied across the doorframe pulled loose and something dropped from above. Reflex took over. He dove forward just as a tin can filled with shrapnel exploded behind him. The blast threw him against the wall, splitting his eyebrow and reopening his forearm wound. His ears rang anew, and the hallway filled with dust. He scrambled away, coughing, barely able to keep his grip on the pistol. His body ached. His mind screamed. But no one came. Either no one heard it, or no one was close enough to respond. He crawled down into a stairwell and collapsed in the corner, heart pounding so hard he could barely remain upright. But the lesson was clear. They were ready for ghosts. They had planned for lone survivors. By the time the sun rose again, his world had narrowed into sharp fragments of time. Move, breathe, observe, hide. Pain faded into background noise. Hunger gnawed at him, but not enough to slow him. He was running on adrenaline, instinct, and repetition. He had been broken off from the mission, forgotten by the plan. But he wasn't dead. Not yet. And that meant the enemy had a problem they didn't know they had. A man behind their lines. A shadow. A survivor. He moved like vapor between the cracks of a burning city. The second day began not with light but with heat. Fallujah in November did not scorch like summer, but the urban terrain trapped warmth between layers of dust, soot, and shattered stone. His clothes were soaked in sweat by mid-morning, despite the bite of desert wind. The wound on his arm had begun to stiffen, the improvised bandage soaked through and stained dark. He had no antibiotics, no antiseptic. Infection was not a question of if, but when. The swelling had spread into his elbow, and his fingers tingled with numbness. Still, he moved. Pain was constant. But pain meant alertness, and alertness meant survival. He avoided wide streets entirely, using drainage ditches, rubble alleys, and crumbling courtyards to navigate. When possible, he climbed. The rooftops gave him visibility, patterns, paths. He saw where fighters moved, typically in groups of 3 to 5, armed with AKs and RPGs, moving through shadow corridors with practiced ease. They communicated with hand signs, occasionally barking instructions. Some were foreign, their accents clipped and harsh. Others were young, local, barely older than teenagers. He stayed low and watched. He noted rally points, equipment dumps, makeshift sentry nests. He mapped escape routes by memory, always charting 3 exits from every space he entered. He didn't know if anyone was coming for him. He didn't operate with hope. He operated with calculation. He found shelter in the crawl space of a school that had long since stopped teaching. Children's desks lay broken in the courtyard, and rusted lockers had been converted into weapons storage. The space beneath the floor was tight, filled with trash and broken glass, but it offered shade and concealment. From a narrow vent, he could watch the road leading to a partially collapsed overpass where insurgent vehicles idled in rotation. He spent the afternoon there, drinking the last of his water, letting his body cool and his mind process. He chewed on a crushed protein bar he had forgotten in his back pocket. The taste was stale, but it slowed the hunger. By nightfall, his legs had begun to cramp from lack of movement, but he dared not shift too often. Foot patrols passed every few hours, their flashlights sweeping over walls and into broken windows. Once, someone approached the school, climbing the stairs overhead, but never came down. He held his breath the entire time. Silence was survival. At dusk, he moved again. He crossed the northern edge of the industrial zone, heading toward a sector the Marines had marked on older maps as partially cleared. He knew that term was loose. Cleared often meant entered once, no gunfire. But it offered more ruins, more wreckage to disappear into. Along the way, he passed bodies. Some were insurgents, limbs blackened from blasts, weapons still clenched in death grip. Others were civilians, collapsed in doorways or wrapped in cloth beside the street. He didn't stop. He didn't speak. In one home, he found a woman sitting silently beside a covered corpse, eyes blank, unmoving. She didn't look at him. He stepped around her and vanished back into the corridor maze. That night, he found an intact water tank behind a gutted gas station. The top was open, and the water inside was lukewarm, stagnant, but clear. He drank deeply, not caring about taste or bacteria. He refilled his canteen, splashed his face, and pressed wet cloth to his cracked lips. The water woke something in him. A forgotten clarity. He checked his magazines. 27 rounds remaining between both clips. His sidearm was clean, oiled only with sweat and blood, but functional. He rewrapped his arm with fresh cloth, this time tighter, packing the wound with gauze ripped from a burned first aid kit he had scavenged from a truck chassis earlier in the day. He sterilized the blade of his bayonet over a small flame, then cut open the edge of the wound to drain pressure. The pain made him black out for a moment. When he came to, his vision was spotty, but the swelling had reduced slightly. He had no choice. Waiting for help wasn't an option. Fallujah would not give him time. He began marking walls, not with symbols, but with scratches, coded slashes indicating direction, safety, or danger. Left meant clear. 2 vertical meant watch for patrols. A triangle meant resupply potential. He used the back of a shell casing to etch the marks just above boot height, blending them with existing bullet scars and graffiti. He didn't know if anyone would see them. Maybe another Marine, another squad sweeping through days from now. Maybe no one. But it gave structure to the chaos, a logic only he understood. The city was his enemy, but also his map. On the 3rd morning, his reflection in a cracked mirror startled him. Dirt caked in every pore. Blood had dried into lines down his face. His eyes were yellowed with exhaustion, pupils narrowed from constant darkness. His mouth hung slightly open when he wasn't aware. He looked like a man half alive. He knew it. That was part of the design. If he was to survive, he had to disappear not just from the enemy, but from himself. No emotion, no memory, Only forward motion, only function. That day, he climbed to the third floor of a gutted tenement building that overlooked a narrow T-junction, a known traffic point for enemy logistics. He watched through a cracked window, tracking movements with the calm detachment of a sniper. No rifle. Just eyes. Just data. He saw when they moved ammo. He saw who gave the orders. He saw which man had the radio and who was guarding him. And he planned. By dusk, he had found a discarded RPG in an upstairs hallway. It was cracked. The sights broken. But the warhead was intact. He weighed options. It was suicide to use it as is. But disassembled, with the right pressure, he could trigger a diversion. He worked by matchlight, pulling wiring with tweezers, isolating a fuse. He wasn't an engineer, but he had watched field techs do it enough times. At midnight, he set the charge under the rusted chassis of a sedan parked beside the junction. It wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to scatter. As the patrol moved past, he ignited it from a distance using copper wire and a scavenged car battery. The blast shook windows for 2 blocks. As they scrambled to respond, he moved in the opposite direction, deeper into the ruins, closer to the last known marine lines. His body was failing, his mind frayed. But the plan was working. He had made noise on his terms. The city had noticed. Now he just needed to survive long enough for someone else to see the signal. He didn't know if anyone had seen the explosion, but the chaos it created gave him exactly what he needed. Space. When the blast went off, a small patrol of insurgents abandoned their watchpoint at a rooftop checkpoint 2 blocks south. He watched them scatter, shouting over radios, sprinting toward the fireball without formation or order. That was the weakness he needed. As they moved east, he slipped west. Behind him, a plume of smoke rose through the fractured skyline. Gunfire erupted in the distance. The city, for the first time in hours, stopped watching him and started watching itself. Using the cover of confusion, he moved faster than he had since the explosion that separated him from his team. He had memorized the satellite imagery from pre-mission briefings. Somewhere in this sector was a structure tagged as a fallback resupply node, used during the first phase of the offensive before the front line moved north. If it hadn't been stripped, it could be his only chance. By sunrise, he had reached the perimeter of the marked site, a partially collapsed bakery with a steel door bolted shut and sandbags stacked along the windows. Someone had used it. Whether friend or foe, he didn't know. He watched the building for nearly 2 hours, crouched behind the skeleton of a destroyed van, observing patterns. Nothing moved. No heat shimmer. No reflections. Slowly, he approached, clearing the entryway with his sidearm drawn. Inside, the space was cold and smelled of ash. Empty ammo crates lined the walls, and a blood trail stained the tiles behind the counter, ending in silence. Whoever had used the place last had left quickly, or been taken. But in the corner, beneath a tarp and crushed ration boxes, he found what he needed. A field radio, half buried and silent. Its antenna was bent, the casing cracked, but the internals looked intact. He sat beside it, shielding it from line of sight with a metal rack, and began testing the system. Static. He adjusted the frequency, sweeping through dead bands, listening for any signal, any burst. At 40.670 MHz, he caught a flicker, encrypted data. It wasn't voice, but it was structured. It meant the channel was alive, possibly bouncing from a drone relay or command element. He keyed the mic, coughed once to clear his throat, and transmitted a single code phrase from memory. 8 syllables embedded in training, reserved for last resort contact behind hostile lines. Then he waited. For 6 minutes, there was nothing. Then, faintly, a reply. Just a ping, encrypted, unreadable without proper decoders, but proof someone was listening. He didn't respond further. He didn't transmit coordinates. He knew better. The city was listening too. Instead, he began preparing. If someone had heard him, a quick reaction force might be inbound within hours or days. That meant staying alive long enough to mark his position, signal safely, and hold the perimeter until contact. He started building distractions. Using wiring, scrap metal, and debris, he fashioned sound traps, cans rigged on trip lines, makeshift clatter mines that would alert him to movement near the building. He blocked entry points with stacked furniture and dragged a burned refrigerator across the main hallway to serve as a ballistic barrier. Every 15 minutes, he changed elevation within the building, First floor, then roof, then the rear storage room, never sleeping in the same place twice. He rotated rest periods in 20-minute bursts, enough to restore clarity but never enough to risk fading into unconsciousness. He set out just before nightfall to secure a higher vantage point, a rooftop 2 buildings over with line of sight to the main boulevard. It was risky, open ground, no cover. But the rooftops had something no alley could offer: vision. He crawled across exposed ledges, hugging walls, ears tuned to every shift in the wind. At the rooftop edge, he placed the last item in his kit, a signal marker. It wasn't military issue. It wasn't elegant, but it was functional. He had stripped a reflective car windshield cover into 3 angular panels and arranged them in a V pattern, visible only from high above. It was a signal taught to forward recon, artificial symmetry in chaos. From the sky it would shine like a beacon. No random debris ever fell in perfect geometric shape. Then he waited. For 6 hours he sat behind a crumbling parapet, the wind clawing at his skin, his limbs cramping from stillness. Twice he spotted movement on the street below, fighters moving tactically, searching homes, dragging wounded. They never looked up, they never noticed him. And sometime after midnight, he saw the blink. Far above, cutting through the clouds, infrared strobes, rapid and artificial. A drone. One of theirs. It circled twice, then vanished. He returned to the fallback site, his legs barely carrying him. But he knew the pattern. That was Phase 1. Verify signal. Phase 2 would come next. Ground contact. Extraction. By sunrise, the sound of distant armor rumbled through the eastern corridor. Not insurgent tech. Too clean. Too synchronized. He rose from behind the barricade and moved to the roof once more. A lone scout drone hovered in the distance, and then, unmistakably, a second signal marker blinked into place. 3 flares in succession. He recognized it immediately. Friendly ground force. Special insertion team. Moving fast. He scrambled back down, gathered his remaining gear, and removed all trace of his presence. He placed a single mark in the stairwell, a triangle, pointing up. Then, he moved to the secondary exit and waited. 30 minutes later, they arrived. The operators came silent, weapons ready, eyes scanning every angle. He stepped forward slowly, hands visible, whispering the recognition code. One of them nodded. They surrounded him, checked him, confirmed identity, and swept the area. He could barely speak. His lips cracked, body sunken, weight lost, wounds barely clotted. But he was standing. They extracted him by foot to a secure rally point, then airlifted out on a blackout route using a low-altitude transport bird. He collapsed in the back of the vehicle, staring at the ceiling, hearing nothing, seeing everything. His mission had ended, but the city had not let go of him. Not yet. He didn't register most of the exfiltration. His memory of that hour came in fragments, half-lit figures in camouflage, firm hands pulling him behind shattered walls, the sharp crack of suppressed weapons clearing their path, the soft mechanical hum of radios exchanging encrypted chatter over his head. The movement was surgical, precise, conducted in near-total silence as the Special Operations team guided him block by block toward a designated rally zone. Every 30 meters, they stopped to scan rooftops. One man kept a steady grip on his back, subtly directing his steps. The Marine could barely walk unaided. His legs trembled from exhaustion, dehydration, and trauma. But he moved, step by agonizing step, driven not by strength, but by the singular knowledge that he was almost out. They reached the rally point, a basement-level safehouse beneath a half-destroyed mechanics shop, just as dawn began to lighten the eastern edge of the city. Inside, the team established a secure perimeter, deployed signal dampeners, and initiated their second phase. Exfiltration via rotary wing. The Marine sat slumped against a wall, shivering despite the rising heat, clutching a bottle of saline water pressed into his hand. He drank slowly, unable to feel relief. His mind refused to accept the safety. His thoughts still lived in alleyways full of eyes, in stairwells laced with wire, in windows where shadows moved with rifles. One of the operators, the team medic, cleaned his arm wound with antiseptic. The pain returned in waves, sharp, pulsing. Infection had taken hold. He would later learn that his fever had reached dangerous levels. His body had gone far beyond its limits. As the Black Hawk approached, the ground trembled faintly. The team checked weapons one last time, eyes sharp, movements fluid. The dust kicked up long before the rotors came into view. The helicopter appeared like a phantom through the haze, low, fast, its door gunners scanning the street with infrared optics. They signaled with an IR strobe, confirmed visual, and moved as one. The team led him in a tight wedge, guns outward, bodies shielding his. The street ahead had been cleared by forward recon hours before, but no one trusted it. Every rooftop could be a nest. Every corner could hide a last defiant shot. They boarded in under 15 seconds. The Marine was the last one in. As he stepped onto the skid, a burst of gunfire cracked from a second-story window across the block. The rounds missed wide, but the door gunner replied instantly, sending a stream of 7.62 rounds into the source. The helicopter lifted sharply, rising above the rooftops with a violent shudder, banking hard westward. Below, Fallujah shrank into a pattern of broken geometry, black smoke twisting upward like the memory of every body buried in the streets. He didn't look down. He leaned back, eyes closed, helmet tilted forward, lips cracked and silent. They reached the combat support hospital 34 minutes later. As they wheeled him off the bird, he drifted into unconsciousness. His last vision, a ceiling of flickering fluorescent lights, and the blurred outline of a nurse pressing a mask to his face. The next time he opened his eyes, he was in a sterile room surrounded by silence, IVs in both arms, bandages wrapped around his chest and legs. His uniform was gone. His sidearm confiscated for decontamination. His dog tags placed neatly on the metal table beside him. For hours, no one asked questions. The attending officer simply noted vitals, updated charts, and stepped away. When a senior intelligence officer finally arrived, it wasn't with a celebration. It was with a notepad, a single recorder, and a list of questions that would never leave the building. How did he survive? What enemy positions did he observe? Did he engage? Did he record any names, any languages, any command structures? He answered them all in clipped detail, drawing maps from memory, identifying insignias, recalling faces and equipment configurations with a level of clarity that surprised even him. Trauma, it seemed, had sharpened memory rather than erased it. But the conversation turned cold when he asked one question in return. Had anyone been looking for him? The officer didn't respond, just tapped the pen twice and moved on. That silence was an answer. He was debriefed, evaluated, and placed in recovery for weeks. He said little. The other patients gave him space. Some saluted when he passed, others offered nods without words. His story had already begun to spread, not as an official report, but as a whisper. A Marine who survived Fallujah alone. A man who returned from the dead with nothing but scratches and silence. Eventually, a formal commendation arrived. It was brief, sterile. It spoke of exceptional endurance under isolated conditions and maintenance of operational security. It made no mention of how many blocks he had crossed alone, how many hours he had gone without sleep, how many times he had nearly bled out in the dirt of an enemy city. There was no parade, no ceremony, only a signature, a folded flag, and a plane ticket back to base. He returned to duty, but something had changed. He spoke less, slept less, drilled harder. His fire team welcomed him back like a ghost returned. They asked no questions. They didn't need to. In the field, his instincts had become sharper, almost unnatural. He would pause seconds before an ambush, point out booby traps others missed, move through darkness like he belonged to it. Eventually, he was offered rotation out of active deployment. He declined. Instead, he took assignment after assignment, each more distant than the last, each further from the city that had tried to claim him. But Fallujah never left his bloodstream. It had marked him, not with medals, not with scars, but with something deeper. The knowledge that in the silence between gunshots, in the breath before surrender, there still existed a choice. Fight, move, endure, return. He left the Marine Corps 2 years later, not with fanfare or retirement parties, but with a quietly signed release form and a duffel bag of worn gear. There was no announcement, no speech from a commanding officer, no lineup of fellow Marines saluting his exit. He didn't want it. He didn't ask for it. He simply packed what he had, nodded once to the men he had trained and deployed with, and walked off the base without looking back. What had happened in Fallujah was never discussed. Not in public. Not in post-deployment reviews. Not even among his closest brothers. It had become a ghost story in the barracks, a cautionary tale among new recruits. The Marine who survived 3 days alone behind enemy lines. the man who radioed back from the grave. But to him, it was never a legend. It was a wound that never scabbed, a memory without language, a silence that lived behind his eyes and bled into every moment of peace. Civilian life didn't fit. It was too loud in all the wrong ways, too soft in the moments where he expected hardness. Crowds made him uneasy. The way people stood in lines, shoulder to shoulder, without scanning exits or evaluating threats, he couldn't do it. Grocery stores made his skin crawl. He timed his visits for midnight, moved down aisles like he was clearing them, left his cart half full if the weight of the fluorescent lights and idle chatter became too much. He avoided public transportation. He sat with his back to walls in every restaurant, every cafe, every waiting room. His eyes never stopped searching. His hands never relaxed. He didn't hear fireworks on the 4th of July. He heard mortars. When people spoke too loudly, it triggered a flood of reflexes, muscle tension, clenched teeth, narrowed breath. He didn't tell anyone. The VA appointments were short. Boxed questions, measured answers. He nodded when they asked if he was sleeping, lied when they asked about flashbacks. What could he say? That some nights he would wake up crawling across his living room floor, convinced he was still under rubble? That the smell of burning oil made his throat tighten until he couldn't breathe? That he kept his pistol disassembled under his bed not for safety, but because he didn't trust himself to fall asleep knowing it was whole? No one wanted to hear that. They wanted heroes, not men still crawling through their own memories. He worked construction for a while. The noise helped, the structure, the weight of tools in his hands. He could lose himself in motion, wake up before the sun, work until his muscles failed, fall asleep from exhaustion. But eventually, even that frayed. He began walking instead, long stretches of road, highway shoulders, dirt paths through pine and dust. He stopped checking in with family, stopped answering calls. Each year, as November approached, something inside him tightened. The days grew heavier, the air more distant. On the anniversary of his disappearance, he would vanish again, just for a day. He'd pack a single bag, drive into the wilderness, and hike until the sound of traffic disappeared. Then he'd sit on a ridge, usually at dusk, light a flare he carried just for that moment, and watch the smoke rise alone into the sky. It was the only ritual that made sense. He never called it survival. He called it maintenance, the slow, grinding act of not falling apart. Some days were easier. Some days, the silence in his mind matched the silence around him. But most days, there was a ringing, a phantom echo of those 72 hours in Fallujah. He could still hear the click of spent casings on tile, still see the dust catching in rays of failing sunlight through bullet holes in a wall, still feel the weight of his own breath, trying not to be heard as enemy boots passed inches from where he hid beneath broken wood and blood-stained bricks. Once, years after discharge, he met another Marine who had served in Fallujah. They talked about the city in abstract, the smell, the dust, the way the buildings were never still. He didn't mention his 3 days. He never did. But the other man said something he never forgot. He said, "That place takes more than lives. It takes your after." And that was it. No follow-up, no explanation. Just a truth exchanged in silence between men who knew. He lived quietly, rented a small cabin near the edge of the forest, no neighbors within shouting distance, no traffic at night. He cooked simple meals, read survival manuals like they were scripture, and listened to shortwave radio even when nothing was broadcasting. The sound of static was comforting. It reminded him of trying to call for help through broken comms, of waiting for a voice on the other end that might never come. That waiting, that expectation of contact in the void, that had become his new war. He didn't die in Fallujah. His body made it out. His voice returned. His skin healed. But some core part of him never escaped that city. It stayed buried in those alleyways, crouched beneath rubble, listening to the wind carry the sound of enemy boots. No medal was pinned to that version of him. No flag folded. It simply faded into dust, remembered only when the night grew too quiet and the memory returned uninvited. And so each year, on that same night, he walked out beneath the sky alone, lit that flare again, and watched it burn against the dark. Not for rescue, not for recognition, but as a reminder that for 3 days in hell, when everything else had failed, he had endured. Not with glory, not with vengeance, just with silence, and the will to live long enough to see the sun rise again.